After the end of World War II, the once mighty German tanks, which had rolled across Europe with devastating force, were left abandoned, rusting in depots and battlefields. These colossal machines, now useless in the new post-war world, posed a perplexing question for the Allies. What should be done with tens of thousands of tanks, symbols of destruction, now rendered obsolete? Some were repurposed for scrap, others stored away, and a few displayed as trophies. Yet, despite their disrepair, these tanks lingered, silent, immobile remnants of a dark era, their fates sealed by a world desperate to rebuild and move forward. After the dust settled across Europe, the war machines of the Nazi regime fell silent. Yet, in the months and years following the end of World War II, the colossal machines of destruction, tanks, armored vehicles, and military machinery stood abandoned on battlefields and in military depots, no longer serving their original purpose. But what became of the thousands of German tanks that were seized, recovered, or abandoned in the aftermath? These behemoths, which had once struck fear into the hearts of their enemies, were now surplus, unwanted, and largely useless in the new world order that had emerged after the fall of Hitler's Reich. The question of what to do with these tanks had no easy answer. The sheer scale of the situation was staggering. The Allies had recovered approximately 45,000 German military vehicles by the end of the war, tanks being the most visible and perhaps most emblematic of them all. With the Axis powers defeated, the logistical nightmare of what to do with these machines loomed large. To a war-weary Europe, tanks were no longer a necessity. They were reminders of destruction, of violence, of an ideology that had been decisively crushed. And yet, their presence presented a challenge of its own. The post-war world was one of scarcity, rebuilding, and reordering. In the immediate aftermath, military priorities shifted dramatically. The Allies' own tanks, equipment, and armaments were often considered far more valuable than the German machines that had once so confidently rolled across European landscapes. As the occupying powers took control of Germany, the tanks and armored vehicles captured from the enemy were often simply abandoned in storage depots, left to rust in the open air. It was estimated that by 1946, over 30,000 vehicles, tanks included, lay in such fields and warehouses across Europe, their future uncertain. Economically, the continent was shattered. In Britain, the US, France, and the Soviet Union, the pressing need was not to maintain these captured tanks, but rather to invest resources in rebuilding civilian infrastructure and the economy. The staggering costs of maintaining the war effort left little room for military excess. The U.S. alone spent over $1 billion annually on its occupation forces in Germany, a financial burden that weighed heavily on the Allies' decision-making. The tanks, massive in size and weight, required substantial upkeep, resources, and manpower, precious resources that were better used in rebuilding cities or assisting with reconstruction efforts. The more practical question became, how could these massive steel beasts be dealt with efficiently, without draining more resources? Early on, many of these tanks were considered surplus and redundant, made obsolete by newer technologies and strategic needs. As the Cold War began to take shape in the late 1940s, the geopolitical landscape demanded that military resources be redirected. Tanks that had once been symbols of Nazi strength were now seen as symbols of a bygone era, wartime relics. There was, however, a temporary value in salvaging them for parts, for raw materials, and for scrap. The economic pressures of the post-war period made it clear that these vehicles would not be retained for their original purpose. In some places, such as the Soviet Union, the tanks were often repurposed for their metal content, to be melted down and recycled for other uses. The Soviets were especially efficient in stripping down anything of value. The Germans' formidable heavy tanks, such as the Tiger and Panther, were ideal candidates for this process. Ironically, the very strength and size that made these machines so fearsome in battle also made them costly to maintain. Parts that could not be reused were often sold off as scrap, and the bodies were crushed into heaps of unusable metal. In other areas, including Britain and the United States, the question of how to dispose of German tanks became a matter of both practicality and strategy. The British, who had seized thousands of German vehicles, including tanks, from the battlefields of France, Belgium, and Germany itself, struggled to find a clear path forward. Tanks like the Panzer IV, the Panther, and the Tiger were all too valuable to simply discard, yet none of the Western powers saw a use for them in the post-war landscape. The U.S. military, deeply involved in the occupation of Germany, found itself similarly burdened. In the early months after the war, the idea of salvaging the tanks for use in a potential Cold War against the Soviet Union seemed far-fetched. And yet, the tanks were not immediately disposed of. They sat in depots, stored in large, weathered warehouses, some of which would later serve as repositories for other surplus wartime equipment. Some of the vehicles were briefly considered for use in specialized training programs for American troops, but these ideas were quickly dismissed due to the logistical challenges involved. In many cases, these German tanks were transported to remote military yards and airfields, where they remained in place for months, sometimes years, without any clear plan. In France, where vast numbers of German tanks had been abandoned, the French army also faced a similar dilemma. The country's war economy had been exhausted, and while the tanks were technically valuable, they became an economic burden that could not be justified. What was left behind after the war, according to one observer at the time, was a country of tanks with no war to fight. As the months passed, some of the more iconic German tanks, like the Panther and Tiger, were placed on display as war trophies in public parks or outside military installations, a haunting reminder of the conflict that had just ended. It wasn't uncommon to see them sitting motionless, gathering rust, as locals went about their daily lives. These vehicles, which had once roared through European streets, now became museum pieces, artifacts of a brutal past. Yet, as they sat idly, questions about their future persisted. For some, the idea of using these tanks in future wars was almost unthinkable, given the rapid technological advancements that were beginning to shape military strategy in the post-war years. Tanks from the Second World War were increasingly seen as symbols of an older, more destructive era, their designs unable to keep up with the new trends in armored warfare, which favored speed, mobility, and more sophisticated weaponry. The very tanks that had terrorized Europe for years were now relics of an old war, their usefulness exhausted. For some of the captured German vehicles, however, the story didn't end with abandonment or scrapping. A few, notably those in Allied hands, were kept for experimental purposes, studied for their advanced engineering or unique features. Some of the most famous German tank designs, including the formidable Tiger I, were dissected and analyzed in hopes of gaining insight into the technical prowess of the Nazi war machine. The Allies wanted to understand how the Germans had achieved such formidable power in their armor and weapons. This period of exploration, though short-lived, marked a time when these once-feared tanks were reduced to mere objects of study. What, then, was the final fate of these recovered German tanks? The answer, of course, is far from straightforward. Some were melted down for scrap, others were abandoned in warehouses, and some even found their way into museums, surviving as silent witnesses to a bygone age. But one thing is certain: by the time the world had begun to rebuild, these tanks were no longer instruments of war. Their significance had evaporated, and they had become an inconvenient reminder of the destructive forces that had once shaped the course of history. The fate of the German tanks, though scattered across the globe, left a legacy not of victory or glory, but of waste, uncertainty, and a world struggling to make sense of the devastation that had unfolded. And yet, the tanks remained, silent, metal giants, abandoned in the rubble of a world that had decided they no longer belonged. In the years that followed the end of the war, the fate of the thousands of captured German tanks slowly solidified. Yet, as their future hung in the balance, many of the decisions made were shaped by the peculiarities of the new geopolitical climate and the urgent need to rebuild war-torn Europe. While some tanks were ultimately repurposed for industrial use, others lingered in military yards, becoming part of an eerie post-war landscape of neglect. By the end of 1946, many of these German tanks had already begun to suffer the effects of abandonment. Tanks like the Panzer IV, Panther, and Tiger, some of the most formidable designs ever built, were left in vast, open-air storage yards in Germany, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. With no war to fight, they were slowly being reclaimed by nature. The steel of the machines, once gleaming in the horrors of war, was now rusting, their engines silent, their turrets aimed at nothing. Despite their initial value as spoils of war, the tanks were becoming increasingly costly to store, maintain, and secure. As the world turned its attention to post-war recovery, these tanks, once symbols of Nazi military might, were seen by many as little more than a burden. In the Soviet Union, the situation was particularly acute. While the Red Army had taken control of vast amounts of German territory, including some of the most advanced tank designs, the sheer number of tanks posed significant logistical challenges. The Soviets had their own tank programs, which by the mid-1940s were evolving rapidly with designs like the T-34 and IS-2, which had already shown their superiority on the battlefield. The idea of integrating captured German tanks into Soviet forces seemed increasingly impractical. Instead, the Soviets took the most notable of the German tanks, like the Panther and Tiger, and sent them to be studied and analyzed in secret military facilities. At first, the intention was simple enough: learn from the German engineering and technology. German tanks were notorious for their advanced armoring, powerful guns, and innovative engineering. The Soviets, always keen on improving their own armored warfare capabilities, eagerly examined the technical blueprints and mechanical intricacies of the captured vehicles. But soon, it became clear that while the Germans had built tanks that were formidable in combat, they had done so at a tremendous cost. The complexity of the designs, combined with the difficulty in manufacturing and maintaining such vehicles, made it clear that they were not suited for the long-term needs of the Red Army. The Soviets did not completely discard these tanks, however. Some, like the Panther, were used for training purposes, where their robust designs could teach soldiers about the enemy's technological strengths and weaknesses. Other tanks were kept in secret storage for years, as a symbol of Soviet victory and superiority over the German military. But the need for immediate practicality, combined with the mounting pressure of rebuilding a war-ravaged nation, meant that these tanks would not remain long in the Soviet arsenal. They were eventually dismantled, melted down, or simply forgotten. Across Western Europe, the scene was much the same. Tanks that had once been the hallmark of the Nazi war machine were no longer needed. The British, in particular, faced a challenging post-war period. Already deeply entrenched in the cost of occupation and reconstruction, the British Army had little use for the thousands of German tanks that lay scattered across Europe. Early on, the tanks were sent to scrap yards, where they were systematically disassembled. Steel and other valuable materials were salvaged and repurposed for civilian use. What had once been the foundation of the German war effort was now being turned into the building blocks of post-war recovery. Yet, not all the tanks were immediately destroyed. Some were put on display in public parks or military compounds as trophies of war. These tanks became part of the landscape of a Europe that was, for better or worse, still haunted by the shadow of the war. The remnants of these war machines stood as stark reminders of a brutal past, often attracting crowds of curious onlookers, some of whom had lived through the conflict and others who had only heard the stories. The tanks, while no longer symbols of power, became symbols of victory, an uneasy victory in a Europe still struggling with the trauma of its recent past. In France, the legacy of the German tanks was perhaps the most visible. After the liberation of Paris and the defeat of the German forces, France found itself in the peculiar position of being both a victim and a victor. While the French resistance had played a significant role in the liberation of their country, the presence of German military machines across their land was a constant reminder of the occupation. As a result, the tanks left behind in the wake of Germany's surrender were initially kept for inspection, with some still standing in the French countryside as reminders of the war. In the years immediately following the war, France, like other Allied powers, struggled to manage the overwhelming task of rebuilding. The economy was fragile, and resources were scarce. French military officials saw little use for the German tanks. Many of the vehicles were transported to depots, where they were stored or dismantled. The French government also considered selling off some of the tanks to other countries, including former colonies in Africa, as the need for military hardware persisted across the globe. However, the majority of these tanks were eventually melted down for scrap, the metal repurposed for civilian use in an effort to rejuvenate the country's devastated economy. In the United States, the recovery and disposal of German tanks followed a similar trajectory. By the end of the war, American forces had seized large quantities of German military equipment. Unlike the Soviets, however, the U.S. military faced less of a need to study German engineering, having already established its own dominance in tank design. Early post-war assessments suggested that the German tanks, while impressive in terms of firepower and protection, were not sufficiently adaptable to the new needs of modern warfare. American soldiers, many of whom had spent years fighting against the German war machine, found themselves in a new reality, one where these once feared machines were now irrelevant. The American military's post-war focus was on the atomic bomb, air power, and rapidly modernizing ground forces. By the late 1940s, there was little interest in maintaining large stocks of captured German tanks. Most of the tanks, including the imposing Tiger I and the versatile Panzer IV, were dismantled. Some were used for target practice or in training exercises for U.S. military personnel. But the majority of these once mighty vehicles were sent to the scrapyards, where their hulking forms were reduced to twisted scrap metal. It was a silent, almost unnoticed end for these war machines that had once been symbols of fear and aggression. As the 1950s dawned, the Cold War began to reshape the military priorities of the world. The massive stockpiles of German tanks and equipment were now nothing more than relics. They had outlived their usefulness, their steel frames and powerful engines no match for the new era of missile warfare and atomic weaponry. The tanks had become obsolete. But the tanks' final days, although largely unseen, were not without their significance.